Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 297 of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today, I have back with me my good friend and colleague, Mike Volkov. In this episode, Mike and I take a look at the top FCPA enforcement actions from 2016, some of the top compliance issues from 2016, and then we turn to some of the issues that might come up in 2017, or at least that we're seeing in our crystal ball. The episode comes in at just over 30 minutes. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I am back with my good friend and colleague, Michael Volkov, and we wanted to give some thoughts on a 2016 year-end wrap-up for FCPA enforcement. Mike, I would note that it looks like 2016 already is going to be a record year, both in terms of number of enforcement actions and fines and penalties in the FCPA world, and with the Odebrecht-Braskem settlement in the greater global fight against anti-corruption or corruption and bribery. But what were some of the either highlights for you this year in the enforcement world?
Well, this was a blockbuster year, no question. And I'm not, the facts back it up, but there's more to it underneath the facts here of, the sort of macro numbers. From the headline standpoint, hey, look, this was a year of record-setting numbers, big cases, all of that. I don't think yet we've seen the one area that we haven't really seen fully developed yet is any sort of post-Yates memorandum indictment of individuals in the cases that came out this year. If there's any case, for example, that cries out for individual prosecutions, I thought it was VimpelCom. So to me, I still don't understand what's going on with, the individual prosecution issues. But going back to what I think are some of the bigger issues of the year, I think the compliance program requirements and the impact of DOJ's compliance counsel, Wei Chen, has been significant, and I think it's going to continue. At least she's put in place, whether she continues in the position or not, she's put in place through the FCPA pilot program remediation requirements for compliance programs, and how they're going to judge compliance programs. And boy, she has really instilled people to push issues related to compliance, and then to hold companies accountable on the remediation prong. We always talk about whether or not people self-disclose or whether people have adequately cooperated. Now we're seeing people failing or, really struggling or having to do a lot to get the remediation credit. So to me, that's one of the biggest issues this year. And what flows from that is the return of the corporate monitor. And that's the reason that we're seeing, we had eight cases this year from DOJ, 8 separate cases with corporate monitors. It's got to be one of the highest numbers in years, if not the highest. But it shows you that companies are not meeting the either the severity of the violation is so significant that it requires it, but that the companies aren't, embracing adequate remediation strategies. And that's because I think she has instilled in people at DOJ, as a compliance professional herself, she knows what people can and should be doing in these situations. So, and I think as we've always seen through the years here, that when DOJ starts to make a compliance push on the enforcement front, it stretches across the entire industry. It's like it moves the bar up all the way across. So I don't know. What do you think, Tom, with that in terms of the compliance program?
That's a really interesting point, and I don't think I had considered it in that manner. Previously, Mike, when I saw corporate monitor, I had assumed it was because the department did not have confidence that the charged party, if that's a term I could use, would implement the solution specified in the enhanced compliance program. And since certainly before 2016, the number of corporate monitorships were being lessened, and the length of the monitorships in many cases was lessened, with some companies getting out of their monitorships early. What I had not fully appreciated was that Wei Chin would bring a level of sophistication on the implementation of the compliance solution required, what you've called remediation, to the fore, and that now the department is focusing more intently on that remediation prong, not only either during the pendency of the investigation, which leads to potential credit for the company, but also afterwards. And if we're going to see more monitors, or rather if the department is going to focus more on the remediation after the DPA or NPA is signed, a monitor can certainly help facilitate that, and we might see more monitors, not really to monitor the conduct to make sure that there are no additional violations, but to monitor the conduct to make sure that the agreed upon remediation going forward is actually put in place. And that's a level of maturity and sophistication for the Department of Justice that really only comes with having someone like Wei Chin who can really advise the department, who are largely, well, not largely, they're all government prosecutors, but who may not have had any corporate experience. So that really would be an interesting development from 2016 going forward.
And the way, the way that this is best exemplified to me is to look at the remediation efforts and the lack of credit given to Embraer, when Embraer, all that they failed to do was that they didn't discipline a senior executive who apparently knew, or at least they said knew about it, but didn't do anything about the bribery scheme. But the failure to discipline that person led to them losing credit for remediation and the overall reduction from the bottom of the sentencing guidelines change. Also, look at the remediation that J.P. Morgan implemented, which was incredible. I mean, not only did they fire people, but they demoted people and they took financial bonuses and benefits away from numerous people who literally were in the chain of command and should have known and should have done their job to sort of stop some of the conduct that was going on around the Sons and Daughters program. And to me, this is really, it means when you are working with a company prior to resolution of the DPA, boy, you better have your game really up. You better, the council better pay more attention to this issue than I think they have in years past. And number two, you raise an even more significant issue, which is, are monitors going to be used to ensure that, post-DPA signatures, that there's going to be adequate implementation of the compliance program representations that have been made in the Schedule C, for example. So, another case where this came up, which was, and I went back, I was, doing my year-end sort of reviews and things like that and writing for the blog, was the LATAM case, the airline case where they, kept the CEO on board. They didn't fire the CEO. Well, they lost, not only did they lose remediation credit, but they had a monitor imposed because, the CEO was involved and settled with the SEC and paid a civil penalty with the SEC, but they didn't fire the CEO. They kept the CEO. And because of that, I think they got a corporate monitor because they didn't like what you're saying, Tom. They didn't trust him that the CEO was going to really be committed to remediating this problem and avoiding a reoccurrence. So they put out a monitor for 3 years. And it wasn't that egregious a case that you and I would sit there and read it and say to ourselves, "Whoa, they're going to get a monitor in this case." But that simple fact of having the violating CEO retained was enough, I think, for DOJ to impose the monitorship. So I think we're seeing a transformation in the situations where corporate monitors are used, like you raised, and the willingness again of DOJ to embrace monitorships when necessary. You're right, the trend was for them to back away from it because of the political controversy that occurred when they first started using corporate monitors in the Bush administration, and allegations of, nepotism, favoritism, whatever, where monitors were connected to the DOJ, former officials. And now, I think DOJ, there's enough time that's elapsed. They also have the memorandum and a pretty well established, it's called the Mumford Memorandum, and they have a pretty good, practice in place for how these people get appointed. So we're going to see more of this, but to me, it's part and parcel of that compliance program requirements are being, the expectation from DOJ is higher and higher now. DOJ is getting much more seasoned in their understanding of compliance and how compliance programs should work. They're very aware of what new technologies and products and services are out there that companies can buy and use. And I think both DOJ and the SEC are stressing more and more the importance of internal controls as a critical, even more critical element in an effective ethics and compliance program. So they're more willing to dig into the details of deficiencies in those. And I think the inevitable result of that will be to push the financial people in a company into the same room with the compliance people to make sure that they're coordinating and talking to each other to at least get input from each other on these types of issues, which I think is a good thing. But I've seen too many silos between compliance and financial people within companies.
And it really, to me, reflects a maturity of the department's understanding of what an effective compliance program is, but also pushing out to not only the companies involved, but as you note, it raises the bar for everyone. The DOJ knows what a best practices program is. They know what a best practices, effective, and even cutting edge technology around compliance is, because companies are coming in and demonstrating compliance or remediation with these cutting edge technologies. So the DOJ, in many ways, it's I wouldn't say it's the laboratory, but it's the place where many of the cutting edge technologies are demonstrated and then communicated out to the greater compliance community, because companies are using those with some success in front of the regulators. So it I think is pushing the bar higher and moving the ball of compliance forward. And I really also like your point about the SEC enforcement push around internal controls. We started seeing that really, I thought, in the second half of 2015. We've had a multitude or a plethora of internal control cases this year, which emphasizes the SEC belief that internal controls and accurate financial reporting, which are their accurate financial reporting is their core mission, that you achieve that through internal controls. And companies need to understand that around the FCPA enforcement. And of course, we saw that with the United Airlines case, which we both talked about a little bit on another podcast, where it was domestic corruption. So internal controls is going to become even more important going forward. So it's really interesting that the Department of Justice now, in many ways, I think, and the SEC as well, but the regulators are in many ways leading the discussion of what is a cutting edge to a best practices just to a regular must-have. And Wei Chin, I think, can be credited with a lot of leading that discussion.
No question. And another example, and I think besides internal controls, another specific example to me is what the department expects, and we're going to see, I think, as a best practice or a baseline even with regard to due diligence and third-party risk management. Because DOJ is very much aware of, these vendor solutions that are out there, and I'm not pushing any of them, but there are vendors out there who are offering solutions in this area, and the fact is that DOJ knows that if you spend $80,000 to $100,000, let's say you're a mid-sized company, to implement one of these programs, that it's going to be effective, it's going to be better, it's going to create an auditable trail with regard to how you onboard your third parties and then how you monitor them and audit them and things like that. So I believe this is, for example, another area where the bar is being raised. And if you are still operating a paper due diligence program in a year or so, that's going to be by definition unacceptable. And so in some respects, they're right to push people on this area, because there are solutions out there that can make your life easier, and you can devote more resources from due diligence to other types of aspects of your training program, like your training program or something like that. So and you and I talked about the OXIF case, that showed exactly that DOJ was willing to not only look at the fact of due diligence, but now they want to know what's the quality of your due diligence. How do you review it internally? What data do you look at? How did you assess your data? What did you do to document your review process? And ultimately, they want a full record as to, if you decide to go forward with somebody, how you resolved every red flag and what you based your decision on. And believe me, if it blows up and turns into a bad situation, you better have all of those red flags resolved and everything documented, because in OXIF, they showed that they were willing to, basically describe the internal debate about hiring a joint venture partner in that case. So, compare where we were 5 years ago. These were not discussions we were having. These issues, internal controls, due diligence to such an extent in detail, we were not talking about. We were talking about putting the basic, elements and building blocks of a compliance program down. And I hate to throw out one other term that I think Wei Chen deserves credit for, but was the operationalization of, compliance program. She, I think, described very accurately in some of her public pronouncements what we know, Tom, in terms of the reality within a company. You can have a compliance program on paper, but if you don't have all the people working together and communicating to each other, your program is not operationalized. In other words, HR isn't playing a role in it. Your finance people aren't playing a role in it. Your security people aren't playing a role in it. And legal and auditing aren't. You have to make sure you operationalize the program. Otherwise, it's a paper program. And DOJ has seen so many of those. They're sick of seeing those. And I think what she's saying is, you better come in with at least these types of issues addressed in some meaningful way, and to show us how you've operationalized the program as well. So this is another sort of trend that I see in terms of the language that's being used now around all of this stuff. The compliance area, not just in FCPA, but it bleeds into other areas as well.
So, Mike, one of the other trends that I think we both felt was pretty significant going forward was international cooperation. And before 2016, when I had thought or talked about international cooperation, I thought or talked about it in terms of the investigation. And certainly the DOJ and SEC have been quick to credit other investigative agencies, prosecutorial groups and regulators in other countries. But this year we really saw a coordination in global enforcement. Obviously, the Odebrecht case, fresh on our minds, is a great example. But there were other examples throughout the year really leading to Odebrecht. So how do you see this coordination of international anti-corruption enforcement as something new and different from what we had seen before in terms of the investigations?
Well, I think, and I guess looking at it from a company standpoint, and I'm operating in 84 countries around the world. My biggest fear is, a small incident that occurs in Africa will suddenly be communicated and shared, the information shared with the DOJ prosecutors because they all know each other and they have each other's phone numbers. And all of a sudden, the risk of detection resulting in the FCPA unit launching an investigation against me has increased exponentially. And that's a reflection of the, ground breaking work that DOJ and other international organizations, the UN, the OECD have put together, and the World Bank, to that matter, in terms of bringing people together, bringing prosecutors together. And I think you mentioned to me, Tom, about how DOJ and the SEC have brought foreign prosecutors together with the DOJ to talk about how you prosecute these cases. And just by being together, they open up communication lines. Here's my number. If you need anything in this country, let us know, or vice versa. You need anything in the U.S., let us know. And I think once you break it down into people connecting with each other, all of a sudden now there's enforcement activities where it's all coordinated. You have one proceeding, and you may then divvy up the proceeds amongst the various participating countries so that my company may not be subject to 84 different prosecutions in separate countries, but now we'll have one prosecution and they'll divide it up among the 84 countries, the settlement. And that's those are the extreme examples, but I think that's the model where we're heading towards. And that means that once you break down barriers among the various countries, that increases my risk of detection. And exponentially is what I say. And you've got to be, even more careful, because an allegation in one country can immediately be turned over to the Justice Department, and we don't know what other information they may have, to corroborate that or to build on that. So there are, bringing everybody together in this international effort means greater coordination in that sense means greater risk for the companies. I will say this also, just on a more macro level. There have been people writing in general about how the new administration is going to dismantle FCPA enforcement, and the Chamber of Commerce will finally get what it wants in terms of the FCPA. That is completely contradicted, in my view, by the extent to which you have these international anti-corruption enforcement networks. In other words, the more that this becomes an international effort, the less likelihood there is that the United States would ever attempt to dismantle this. Obviously, it's lucrative, but secondly, it's so interdependent with other countries and other efforts that nobody would want to see the U.S. sort of pull back on this. It's not worth the headaches that will come. And, frankly, Congress isn't going to want to try to, promote a message of, by the way, let's make it easier for companies to engage in foreign bribery. It just is not a good talking point or a marketing presentation. But the internationalization of this makes it harder for the U.S. to just act on its own in terms of pulling back from playing the unique role that they do in FCPA enforcement. That's That's a more macro issue, though.
And in flipping it back from the regulator to the company perspective, one of the things that Kara Brockmeyer emphasized in her talk was that to obtain credit from the U.S. government for fines and penalties you might pay to another country, such as credit Odebrecht received and Embraer received, you have to disclose or get to the U.S. government and meet the other requirements under the pilot program. You may not self-disclose initially to the United States, but you have to self-disclose to those other countries. So that makes the issue of not just the investigation component that you talked about, Mike, but also multiple disclosures to multiple regulatory agencies in multiple jurisdictions becomes a trickier question that has to be answered at the board level, because if you disclose to one or one finds out and you don't disclose to the others, you may lose the ability to receive some sort of credit across the globe, which is what you're going to want at the end of the day if you have a problem. So it makes the investigation, first the detection of any problem, then the investigation of any problem, then the decision of whether or not to self-disclose, and then the actual self-disclosure. Who do you self-disclose? How do you self-disclose? What do you self-disclose? And when do you self-disclose? All, I think, if not more difficult, certainly more intricate questions that companies need to have a protocol in place that allows them to have figured out what they're going to do before they're in an emergency and panic situation.
That is a great point, Tom. And I always think that you can look to the antitrust division and their experience with the leniency program as somewhat of a model for what is going to happen down the road. Because that's exactly what companies do in global antitrust cartel cases. They figure out who to disclose to first, and then they also have to figure out which country do I go to disclose there, or do I go to the EU, and will I be number one or number two or number three there? What's going to happen? And what countries do we have potential liability? So you may have 10 companies that you will disclose to, 10 countries that you may disclose to, and the order in which, or the timeliness of your reporting becomes important. They're just not, you don't just run into each country and tell them something right off the bat on the first day. So there are a lot more issues you have to resolve. So that, to me, is, antitrust is coordinated antitrust enforcement among global enforcement agencies has definitely matured beyond where the FCPA is, and I think that's a model for what's going to happen down the road in terms of that. So you raise a really good point about that.
So if you're listening to this podcast and you're in trouble, my suggestion is you call Mike Volkov.
Well, I hope.
Well, Mike, with that, maybe we could, I was wondering if we could turn to the veiled future and what you might see for 2017 going forward, if 2 or 3 points that you think are that the compliance practitioner needs to consider.
Well, I think number one is please don't expect any significant changes with the new administration. I just don't think it's going to happen, and for a variety of reasons, which I've already talked about. I think we're going to see sort of more, what I would call more compliance program expectations, and where we're going to see them. And I think perhaps the most significant issue, if you're a compliance professional, is you better be focusing on auditing and monitoring your program and your third parties. Those are perhaps the most significant issue to me because that's where the expectations are going to rise. It's one thing to have your auditing program, your auditing provisions with your third parties, and it's another thing to exercise them. And I think they're going to want to see more of that. That's just an example of how compliance programs, they're going to be, higher expectations, along with the issue that we've discussed of internal controls and third-party risk management. I mean, those should be your top three issues in my view, in terms of how you're going to do this. Now, I do think that the new administration, my prediction is we will see some tinkering with the pilot program to perhaps give greater than a 50% reduction from the bottom of the guideline range when you meet the requirements for voluntary disclosure, cooperation, and remediation. I think we're going to see the new administration adopt probably greater certainty of a declination when you meet those three requirements. That's my prediction. And they want to encourage companies to self-report, clean it up, remediate, and if you do that, you're going to get a pass. But what will be required to make that sellable in, the political land is DOJ has got to bring more, and we may see finally this year a little bit more of a push on individuals on the FCPA. We can't just have, these sort of corporate settlements, company pays a lot of money, egregious behavior by various individuals, and no prosecution. Keep in mind, in the antitrust division context, and it took them years to get to this. I mean, they used to have a 1-to-1 ratio of individuals to companies in terms of prosecutions. And then it got to 2-to-1 as the program matured, and as the program has even matured even more in the last, I would say, 10 years, they've gotten it to 3 individuals prosecuted for every company. And I think it'll eventually get there with the FCPA, but we got to first at least get to a 1-to-1 ratio, and they're not even close to that right now in terms of that. So but I do see that those will be my big picks for the year. Obviously, on the individual case fronts, I think we're going to see a Walmart settlement this year, Microsoft's telescenario, which they've already been talking about, billion-dollar type case, and some other cases that should get resolved soon on. But I think Walmart, telescenario seems the closest to being announced, and I bet you we'll see Walmart by the middle of the year. That's my prediction, at least. So we'll see.
2016 has been really a year for the record books, and where 2017 goes, if it has a quarter to a half to 3/4 of what we saw in 2016, it's going to be very interesting for the compliance practitioner going forward.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this inaugural episode in 2017 of the FCPA Compliance Report. I'm developing a mailbag episode, so if you'd like any questions answered, please email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if you've listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast. That would help our rankings on iTunes and help with the number of downloads, so I would greatly appreciate it. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report.